to let everyone know that this webinar session will be recorded and it will be available to view on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/TNCoalition. And it should be posted later this afternoon, so it will be recorded and can be shared and used with staff or in other training sessions, or for those of you who may have staff or colleagues who were not able to attend today due to the training being rescheduled. So today's webinar topic is shelter best practices. We will be talking and basing our information in the Tennessee Family Violence Shelter Performance Standards, which are a document created by the Coalition and the Office of Criminal Justice Programs. You can find it on OCJP's website, that sets down the base minimum standards a program must meet in order to be eligible to receive funding and to be following those minimum best practices. And so again, these standards address the minimum requirements that shelters need to be following in order to receive funding from state and federal family violence sources. They're updated periodically as those minimum requirements change. So I encourage you all to read them when you have a minute. Like I said, they are hosted on OCJP's website. And make sure that you're very familiar with these standards, because these standards are how we base eligibility for funding. They're how we base findings when you are monitored. So these are very impactful in terms of shelter performance and those shelters being eligible for funding, which we all know is incredibly important for our services. And so the Shelter Performance Standards lays down a set of core services that each shelter must meet. At minimum, these services must be available within your shelter. So obviously, that includes 24-hour access to telephone crisis hotline, so you're operating a 24-hour hotline. That includes providing referrals to clients, whether they are staying in your shelter or whether they are simply seeking referral information. Now this one is really important because what we're seeing is a lot of programs who get calls from clients who either A, may not need or be eligible for shelter, or B, may be calling when your shelter is full and you don't have space to house them. Just because they are not going to be residing within your shelter does not mean you should not be providing them with referrals and other services just like you would with any other shelter client. It's important for you not just to say, sorry, we're full, or sorry, you don't you don't meet the standards for our services, you don't qualify for our services, but make sure that you are either referring them to another shelter when you're full, trying to help them find that housing, referring them to your other services, whether that be support groups, counseling, advocacy. Make sure that we are not excluding clients from our other services just because they don't qualify for shelter or that we are not able to shelter them at that time. Another core services is providing counseling for family violence victims, whether that be in-house or whether you are contracting out with counselors, however, whatever arrangement you have set up. Advocacy for family violence victims, we're talking about personal advocacy including safety planning, resource referral. We're talking about legal advocacy, medical advocacy if needed, case management services may fall under this umbrella as well. All of those services which your advocates perform for your clients. And again, these services should be offered to clients whether or not they are residents within your shelter. Transportation arrangements. So we are not necessitating that you transport, but that you either are able to make arrangements or help clients make arrangements with public transportation, with taxi services, with carpooling, with some kind of arrangement to assist clients in getting where they need to go. That may be court, that may be work, that may be school, that may be daycare. Whatever arrangements that they need in terms of transportation in order to empower them to do what they need to be doing within shelter to start building up that independent, empowered life that we want them to start forming. The next service that you want to provide is follow-up care. So making sure that we are following up with clients who call on hotlines. We're following up for clients that we don't see in shelter that we may provide counseling or advocacy to. We're following up with shelter clients and making sure that they're still safe, making sure the information that we gave them worked, making sure that their needs are filled. And also, it is a really important way of evaluating our services is to follow up with clients who have received our services in the past and maybe allow them to do a survey or a questionnaire or just get their feedback in general about their experience with your services. Where did you excel? Where did you have places where you could improve? Where were you lacking? Were there services that they needed that were not available to them? So that is a great way that I think every program should be thinking about how they can evaluate their services with information given from past clients. And the other core service that I'm going to mention this morning is community education and outreach. So making sure that your broader community knows what services you provide, knows that you are a resource, making sure that your broader community is aware of the problem of violence within your community, that it's talked about, that it's open, and making sure also that you are collaborating and networking with those other resources in your community that victims can use, so that you're not remaining so siloed, but that you are really opening yourself up and finding out what is available within your community that would be useful for a holistic approach of treating clients, whether that be mental health services, whether that be substance abuse services, whether that be counseling, whether that be parenting classes, whether that be job skills classes, anything like that. So the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act says that shelter support services must never be presented to residents as being mandatory, nor should shelter residency be contingent upon residents and their dependents participating in shelter support services. So what this says is, number one, you cannot make any of your core services mandatory. So you can't mandate that someone take parenting classes. You can't mandate that someone talks to an advocate. You can't mandate that someone goes to group. You can't mandate that someone does something even though you may think it's the best thing for them or an important piece of their recovery or healing in that moment. You cannot mandate these services. The other half of that is you cannot present a service as either A, being mandatory if they want to stay in shelter. So you can't say things like, if you want to stay here, you have to do A, B, and C thing. You can't say if you want to stay here, everyone who stays in shelter has to go to group, or everyone who stays in shelter has to take a parenting class. But you also do not want, again, as I said earlier, you do not want your services to be only available to those individuals who are residents in your shelter. You want to make sure that shelter stay is not a prerequisite to receiving advocacy and counseling and group and all those other things. So what we want here is voluntary supportive services instead of mandatory services. We want a trauma-informed shelter environment, and part of that is understanding that every client you see has different needs. Every client you see has different paths, different goals, different resources. Some of them may be very interested in parenting classes or in group sessions, and some of them may not. And part of being trauma-informed and empowering clients is to understand that they, forcing them or mandating certain services is taking power and control away. So you're not empowering them, you're not allowing them to choose their path, you're not allowing them to choose what feels best or what their needs are. You're taking their power and control away by mandating these things. And instead, what we want to do is create an environment where survivors control their own lives. Survivors choose if they want to take job skills classes or parenting classes. Survivors choose if they want to come to a group counseling session or meet with an advocate for housing referrals or whatever it may be. We want to make sure that our services are survivor-driven and survivor-led, and that they are centering on empowering survivors and giving control back to the survivors that we work with. And so to that end, it's important for us to remember that survivors must leave their homes in order to gain safety. Survivors haven't done something wrong. Survivors haven't made a mistake. Survivors haven't done something bad or done something worthy of being punished. Shelter is not a punishment. Survivors have been forced to leave their home and leave their belongings and leave what they know in order to gain safety. And shelter can seem punitive to survivors, and shelter can seem like a punishment because now I've left my house, I've left my things, I've left my television, I've left my pets sometimes, I've left all of these things that I know, and I'm in this place where I'm sharing a room with 4 other people, and I'm sharing a bathroom with half a dozen people, and I can't always watch what I want, I can't necessarily cook what I want, I can't always go where I want, and I've lost a lot of freedom, and I've lost a lot of that independence that I may have had before, or at the very least, the material independence that I've had before. And so we have to, as advocates, do everything we can to mitigate the fact that survivors come to us as a consequence of batterers' behavior. And yet the survivors are the ones who are facing an immediate consequence, not the batterers. So when we make these rules and we make these demands and we make these requirements and mandates, we are making an environment that feels like a prison or like a boarding school, that feels very punitive, that feels like a punishment. So we have to remember why we are giving survivors choices, why we are being survivor-centered and survivor-led. So, are there any questions about anything that I've talked about so far or anything that I've gone over so far this morning? All right, I don't see anything, but if you have any questions throughout this process this morning, throughout the webinar, please don't hesitate to go ahead and put them in your question box or your chat box, and I will get to them throughout the process. So you don't have to feel like you have to save them to the end. If you have questions at any moment, just let me know. So to this end, oh, here we go. We do have one quick question. Is it a consequence or a result? So here's what I would say to that. Yes, survivors entering shelter is a result of, first of all, batterers' behavior and batterers' abuse and batterers' threats. It is a result of the fact that our housing system and availability is abysmal, and that survivors are often cut off from financial and personal resources. So all of these, again, are a function of the abuse by the batterer. But it's important to understand that whether you see it or anyone sees it as a result or as a consequence or as just a fact of life, when someone is forced to leave their home because of the behavior of another individual and go to a shelter that may feel like a prison, that feels like a punishment and that feels like a consequence. So when we're talking about how to mitigate that feeling and how to create a trauma-informed environment within shelter, we want to keep in mind a few things. We want to make sure that we are minimizing power differentials. So we are making sure that the survivors that we are working with don't feel like the advocates are wardens or they're gatekeepers or they are police or they are there to be in power over them. So that includes things like, well, I think you should do this, so I'm not going to give you a referral to this other agency. Or things like, you haven't come to parenting classes, so I'm not going to, help you with finding childcare for this other thing. We can't hold referrals and we can't hold advocacy and information and resources over our clients' heads. We can't make them feel like they have to appease us in order to receive the information that they need. And so we want to make sure that we are minimizing the power differential as much as possible, that we are not treating clients like we are babysitters or we are prison guards, that we are treating them as equals, that we are coming to them willing to work on goals and willing to help them with what their needs are and what their choices are as equals, that there is mutual accountability and respect. So we not only want the survivors to be accountable for their actions within shelter, and we not only want the survivors to be respectful of staff and of each other, but we want also the advocates to be accountable for their actions. And so when we promise a resource or we promise to do something for a survivor, to look into something or to make a phone call or to find them a resource or to meet with them on a certain day, that we are accountable and we are following through with what we say, and that we as advocates are respectful, with the understanding that we are not always going to get along with every client that comes through our doors. We are not always going to like every client that comes through our doors. We're not always going to agree with every client that comes through our doors. But our job is not to be friends with everyone. Our job is not to agree with everyone. Our job is to be respectful and to provide those resources as they are needed. The understanding that advocacy and shelter and the entire process is an environment of shared learning, that as advocates we have a lot to learn from survivors, that we are not experts in the lives of survivors, that survivors, again, have their own goals, they have their own skills, they have their own supports and resources and hopes and dreams, and that they have had experiences that we can never know or understand. So it's important to understand that we have things that we can learn, that we can learn and grow from everyone that we interact with. That we assume positive intent, that we know that not everyone that we come in contact with, both personally and professionally, have our best interest at heart, that we know that not everyone is respectful, that we know that not everyone is accountable for their actions, but that we are understanding in a shelter or advocacy environment when we are working with a group of people who have survived horrific ordeals, that we are understanding that their behavior and their responses and reactions to what's happening around them are not going to be the same as ours, okay? That they may be triggered by different things, that they may be re-experiencing certain things, that they may be traumatized in ways that we can't imagine, that they may have developed coping skills that are either unhealthy or that are things that we can't understand, but that it is in a response to an effect of the trauma that they have experienced. So assume positive intent as much as possible, and think about and consider a person's actions from the lens of the trauma that they have experienced. And that advocacy as teamwork. So not only are you a team with your coworkers within your organization, but you are a team with the survivor. When you are advocating for them, when you are helping them find resources, when you are helping them navigate the court system, when you are helping them navigate housing, you are a team with that survivor, and you are also, or you should be, a team with your broader community. Those resources in your community, like housing, like mental health, like substance abuse, like parenting, like education and job skills. You should be calling on all of those people as part of your team as well in order to perform truly effective and holistic advocacy. And another part of trauma-informed shelter services is thinking about and discussing with survivors the ways that shelter can be difficult and offering supportive strategies. So recognizing, first and foremost, that shelter is not an easy place to live, that it's not easy to live with, 10 or 12 or 30 other people, that it's not easy to share space with that many people, that it's not easy to rebuild a life, that it's not easy to recover from trauma, and that there are things about shelter inherently that are incredibly difficult, including just the fact of communal living and shared spaces. Discuss with survivors the range of responses that people have to trauma, and understand that everyone's responses to trauma are different and everybody's path and timeline for healing are different. So what we really want to do here is validate what survivors are going through in terms of their healing process. So they may be in the mode of re-experiencing and having lots of triggers and having night terrors and having that going on. They may be in the mode of really constricting themselves and avoiding a lot of what they did before and a lot of things that might remind them of the perpetrator because they don't want to go through those triggers. They may be experiencing a lot of anxiety. They may be experiencing a lot of depression. They may be experiencing physical health symptoms, digestive problems, or phantom pain symptoms, or fatigue symptoms that they don't understand that are related to the trauma that they've experienced. So having an understanding of trauma response and validating the survivor's experiences and what they're going through. And last but not least, view each survivor as a unique individual who has their own strengths and resources. All survivors are not the same. Even if you have a set of people who have all gone through identical violent experiences, each of them are going to react emotionally, physically, mentally in different ways because every person is different. And thinking about the actual physical space of a shelter, making sure that to the best of our ability, shelters are clean. And this does not mean obsessing over every dish in the sink or obsessing over every unmade bed. This partly we want to understand that everyone's definition of clean is different. So while one person may see something that's not completely spotless and thinks that it's terrible, another person may see something that's slightly cluttered but, physically clean and think that it's fine. So everyone has a different definition of clean, but understanding that we want to make sure our space is physically, that there's not spider webs, that there's not mold, that, things smell good, that the vacuum, that, common and shared spaces are neat and tidy. And the reality is this is something that a lot of shelters struggle with more than almost anything when we're talking about trauma-informed care, and the understanding that we cannot force or mandate clients to do things like cleaning the dishes or mopping floors or vacuuming. A lot of shelter staff really struggle with this. And what we have to understand is that, you know, first of all, the shelter is where clients live. It's their home. And as advocates, the shelter is where you work. It's not your home. So being respectful of client spaces and not treating them like they should be maids in their own home. And understanding that sometimes not being able to mandate that people do things mean that advocates are going to have a little bit of extra work, mopping or doing the dishes or whatever it is. And there are ways around this. I've talked to shelters who give out incentives for doing chores. So they may give out things like gift cards to their thrift store if they operate a thrift store. They may give out things like toiletries or, you know, some kind of little special treat. We have shelters who have found out that the reality is if that advocate goes in and starts cleaning, 9 times out of 10 shelter residents are going to join them and help them. You know, and sometimes all you have to do is ask, can you help me with this? You know, this looks a little rough. What can we do? And again, I'm really focusing on common spaces, shared spaces, and having those conversations about respectful communal living in shared spaces. Because the reality is, if somebody wants to leave their dirty clothes in the floor of their bedroom and not make their bed, then that is their prerogative because that is their home and that is their space. We want to make sure that the shelter offers spaces for privacy. So bedroom doors that close, you know, quiet spaces like quiet reading rooms, spaces that are set aside to be quieter and to be more private. So reading rooms, advocacy offices where a client can go and get some privacy if they need to make a phone call. You know, smaller spaces where clients can go to have a breather and have some time to themselves. We want to make sure that the decorations are welcoming to all survivors, whether they are LGBT, whether they are from a different faith or a different culture, that's welcoming to children, that we don't have spaces where there are breakable things on low tables that little hands can get to. We want to make sure that, you know, the things that we are posting, the artwork that we're posting is not excluding anyone that may come into our shelter. That, you know, if we have a bookshelf full of books, that there is a variety of topics that could be interesting to different people, and that we make sure that we really take a minute to think about the way that our shelter is decorated and arranged and how that might seem to someone who is from a minority, who is not Christian, who is not English speaking, who is an LGBT individual. So think about those physical arrangements. And last but not least, to limit or eliminate altogether graphic posters about violence. And in this case, I'm talking about not only within shelter, although that is incredibly important. We've all seen those posters that are basically awareness-raising posters, but they show, you know, a woman with a black eye, or someone who's all bruised up, or someone who's like curled up crying, and you know, they have slogans like abuse can happen here, or it can happen to anyone, or, you know, it's on us to end it, or whatever. Those posters, first of all, have no place within a shelter because there is no reason for people who have experienced abuse and for children to be exposed to graphic images like that can be traumatizing and triggering, and we don't need it in shelter. I would also argue that any space where you are potentially meeting with a survivor or a client, whether that is your office space, whether that is a waiting room in your office, you know, wherever that may be, that graphic posters like that also do not have any place there, because we don't want to risk triggering any client who comes to interact with us in those spaces. So making sure we're looking at things that speak to equality and openness and the fact that everyone is welcome within our services. So now I want to talk a little bit about shelter rules. We've already touched on this idea that we do not want to be punitive in our rules, and we don't want to be mandating things that are really, at the end of the day, not that important, not that vital to someone's healing and to someone's process, like cleaning and dishes and those kinds of things. So how do we take a look at shelter's rules and figure out if we are, if we're making sure that our rules and regulations are really trauma-informed? So first of all, you want to be sure that whatever rules or policies or guidelines, whatever you want to call them, that they reflect your agency's mission and values. All materials should be friendly. They should invite cooperation, collaboration, and mutual accountability in their tone and wording. Things that are bold, italicized, underlined in all caps, or using a whole slew of exclamation points are not friendly visually. So an example is our program has set up the following rights and responsibilities to clarify expectations and roles and to keep harmony in the shelter where multiple families and individuals live together and share common spaces. We hope you will keep a common good and other safety and comfort in mind while living here. So this has a friendly tone. It invites collaboration, it invites cooperation, it speaks to mutual accountability within the shelter services, and it's in line with values and guidelines of openness and healing, and so I think that this is a great example of the tone that we should be looking for. Rules, policies, guidelines, they should make a distinction between behaviors that facilitate communal living versus behaviors that threaten a resident's ability to stay in shelter. So behaviors that facilitate communal living, like cooking and cleaning, are not behaviors that should threaten a resident's ability to stay in shelter. And your rules should make sure that you differentiate between them. We want to make sure that rules don't feel alienating or threatening, that rules don't make you feel like communal living guidelines can be a cause for removal from shelter. So we don't want to have things like, you know, if you miss cleaning on your day 3 times, then 3 strikes you're out, things like that. It is best practice to separate out information and expectations about communal living and give information about communal living outside of the context of rules. So make sure that the two things are separate. You're giving your set of rules that we're going to talk about, and then you're giving some guidelines about respectful communal living. And, you know, another note is, in general, by and large, we shouldn't be going into really great detail about all of the things that a survivor can do to get kicked out of shelter as soon as they arrive in the intake process. You know, they get to shelter, they're traumatized, they're scared, they're trying to adjust to their new space, they're trying to figure out what's going on and what they should be doing, and then they have an advocate talking to them about this huge list of ways that they can be kicked out onto the streets. And that does not make a safe environment. It doesn't facilitate an environment that feels like a client can relax or is welcome. So we want to be wary of that. And we should strive to focus on advocacy versus rule enforcement. It's our responsibility to meet survivors where they are. If they don't show up at a scheduled advocacy or case management meeting, for example, staff should go look and check on them. You know, they may have had a really bad night. They may have been up all night with nightmares and have slept in. They may be, you know, feeling really depressed that day or really anxious or have a lot of anxiety around having that conversation with an advocate, so they may be avoiding it. And, you know, so advocates have to be willing to physically go and seek out survivors and meet them physically where they are and say, you know, hey, we had scheduled a meeting to talk about housing today. What's up? You know, are you okay? How are you feeling? Do you still want to talk? We can do it, you know, we can do it sitting right here on the couch. It doesn't have to be a scary formal meeting. An emphasis on rule enforcement, so a really rigid, punitive stance on rule enforcement over respect and advocacy and conversation undermines trusting relationships between residents and staff. It can really result in not only clients being unhappy and, you know, clients leaving shelter before they should, and clients, you know, complaining and not making the best or getting the best out of their experience, but it can also result in really low staff morale when staff feel like their constant job is to be the rules police and to be getting these clients in trouble. And so we should think about how we can control the environment to make it conducive to survivors' healing and not be so centered and obsessed with rules. So for example, if multiple residents repeatedly have a difficulty with one particular rule or guideline, then ask yourself, is it possible that a physical fix could alleviate the problem? So for example, if residents have difficulty keeping their rooms clean, is it because they don't have enough closet or storage or shelf space? Or if women are required to keep children in sight at all times, and yet the play space for children, the playroom or the physical space where children can play is not visible from, the kitchen or wherever a client may be to do what they need to do during that day, is it really feasible that a client can have their eyes on that person and that child at all times? So what we want to shift to then, when we're talking about communal living rules or guidelines, is we want to shift from these punitive, rigid rules into a set of rights and responsibilities and cooperative agreements. So for example, residents must respect staff, other residents, and shelter's property. So the right and responsibility may be you have the right to be respected and the responsibility to respect others. So, not only should a resident be respectful, but they also have the right to have respect, to be respected. And I just am very fond of this image. I think it is a great image that could be a great poster for in shelter or for an advocacy office. I think it's important to center all of our rules and all of our guidelines and all of the things, the many things that we tell clients that they need to do and to think about, to center that within respect and center that within safety. So again, an old rule may be you are responsible for the care and supervision of your own children at all times. Well, you know, this is a difficult rule because, first of all, it doesn't take into account the reality that, you know, parents may work, they may go to school, they may have housing appointments, they may have be in group therapy or in parenting classes, or, you know, they may have counseling going. They have all of these things happening in their lives that they cannot necessarily be responsible to have eyes on their child 24 hours a day. And that's a reality of the world, not just shelter, is that parents in the broader world are not expected to have eyes on their child 24 hours a day. And the other thing that this rule does is it makes it hard for women or for individuals in shelter to collaborate with each other and to seek out people who can babysit for them for, you know, a day when they go to a housing meeting, or, you know, can you watch the kids while I cook dinner tonight, or whatever that may be. So we want to think about things like you have the right to be supported in your role as a parent. An advocate should expect that part of their work with parents is supporting them finding some kind of childcare, whether it's a babysitting arrangement or, you know, daycare or whatever that looks like. So another example of an old rule, children should be in bed by 9 p.m. Well, you know, that doesn't take into account that, you know, children developmentally may need different bedtimes that may be later, that children have things like after-school activities and sports and homework, and sometimes teenagers have jobs, that they can't be reasonably in bed by 9 p.m. And also that this rule is really based on the advocates or the staff's understanding of what a bedtime looks like, and not taking into account that a parent in shelter should be able to choose that for their own family. So a better thing might be each family has the right to safety, privacy, and to establish schedules that allow each member adequate rest, peaceful time, and time to complete schoolwork as well as family obligations. So we're not setting a specific hour. What we're saying is you have the right to parent in a way that feels right to you and that meets the needs of your family and children. And what we might think about is a quiet time, maybe after, you know, for instance, after 11 p.m., the shelter is in quiet hours, which means you can be awake and reading or doing homework or whatever you need to do, but it's quiet time, so we're talking about not loud music playing, not loud talking, not loud TV going on. So think about shelter quiet hours. You have the right to be heard. You have the right to self-determination. You have the right to a healthy, sober, and drug-free environment. Other things may be the resident has the right to keep their presence at our program confidential. So you have the right to confidentiality. You have the right to reside in a program that works for you. You have the responsibility of maintaining confidentiality, not just for yourself, but for your fellow residents in shelter. And at the end of the day, we know that shelter is not the right environment for every single individual. We know that shelter space is not, shelter living and communal living is not always right for everyone. And, even if someone can handle shelter living, they may not be right for your particular program. And so if shelter living is not working out for someone, we need to make it about the program and not about them as a person. So I want to, before we wrap up, I want to touch on these model rules for ensuring safety. So what we've talked about so far are rights, responsibilities, guidelines for communal living, but there are 4 main rules that have to do with safety and security of all shelter residents. And these are the 4 rules that, yes, here is where violations of these rules means that we exit someone from shelter. And that has to do with alcohol and drugs in shelter. That has to do with violence in shelter, weapons in shelter, or breaking confidentiality. And all of these things, again, are in order to make sure that shelter is a safe space for the individual. So for everyone within shelter, we're trying to make sure it's a safe and confidential space. So these 4 rules, taking into consideration confidentiality and safety within shelter, these are the 4 where you can talk about if these rules are violated, then we have to start exiting someone from shelter. So we are at the end of our time today. I will send out a copy of the PowerPoint as well as certificates to everyone who attended today. So that will be coming out to you in an email later this afternoon. And I will also try to get you to the link to the webinar recording if that is something that you are interested in. If you have any questions on shelter rules, responsibilities, what that looks like, anything that we've talked about today, go ahead and put it in the chat box if you want me to answer it before we wrap up. And if not, you can also you can feel free to email me at any point, and I'm going to go ahead and put my email up on the screen here. You can feel free to email me at any point with questions that you may have, and I will try to get that to you as quickly as possible. But if you have any questions that you want to ask right now before we wrap up, go ahead and put them in your chat or question box. Or again, you may email me later on. I have a few requests pop up that it looks like we have multiple attending or watching the webinar from one login. If that is the case and you would look for it or an additional email address, please let me know in the chat box so that I have that. And yes, I will send you the certificate along with the copy of the PowerPoint, and you will be able to print that out at that time. So you will have that this afternoon. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I am going to go ahead and close out the webinar for now. As I said, if you have any questions or anything that you want to chat to me about later, just send me an email and look for the email with all of the certificate